So we're lucky to have a really ideal guide to take us through this conversation today. Amy Goodman will be our host and moderator. She'll be up here in a minute. She's really uniquely qualified to lead this discussion. She's devoted considerable airtime, I think, to all the issues raised by our speakers today through her really great program, Democracy Now!, which hopefully you're all familiar with. And after you see her here in action today, you will for sure become familiar with it. You have her full bio and those of all the panelists in your materials, so I won't run through all their accomplishments today. Spare them the embarrassment, and to save our time, we wouldn't have time for the panel. Joining Amy to discuss the groundbreaking reporting that he's done out of Flint is Kurt Guyette, who is really the driving force behind exposing the government failures that led to the public house crisis there, which is still ongoing, as we'll hear today. And that he did so as a reporter for the ACLU working under a Ford Foundation grant is pretty much a perfect microcosm of the varied and creative arrangements under which investigative journalism takes place today. After that, Amy will turn to a discussion that relates to another huge and important recent investigative project, the Panama Papers. And I think it's safe to say that the papers and their secrets would still be in Panama without the efforts of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and its parent organization, the Center for Public Integrity, both of which have faced funding issues at the very same time one of the biggest, if not the biggest, reporting project in their history was taking place. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, and the challenges that it raises about the difficulty in supporting important global investigative journalism are ongoing, even when the work that they're doing becomes ever more increasingly impactful. Peter Bale will be joining us, who's the CEO of CPI, and where he joined in early 2015 from CNN, and we'll also have with him the folks who led the work, Michael Hunt, and I think that'll be a really great discussion that'll lead into the rest of the day today. So with that, I welcome Amy to come up here. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Just let me have a little sip of my Flint water. I wish we could smile. Well, it's really wonderful to be with you all today. And for me to be with people who I've met through the remote studio TV screen when I interview them on Democracy Now!, but to get to spend time with them. In this first half hour, we're going to talk about Flint, Michigan, and what happened. April 2014, an unelected city manager of Flint, Michigan, decides to turn off the spigot of water to Flint that the city had used for over half a century, the Detroit water system, and hook up to the corrosive Flint River, to the shock of so many, to the shock of the more than 100,000 people of Flint. Democracy Now! Went to Flint, Michigan, spoke with many people. Michael Moore tweeted, "Lead isn't the poison in Michigan, fascism is." He said, "How do you toss a democratic election in the garbage and get away with it?" When we went to Flint, we spoke to, people like Claire McClinton of the Democracy Defense League. She said, "We don't just have a water problem, we've got a democracy problem. We've got a dictatorship problem." The people of Flint and its elected government did not decide to make this switch. The governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, appointed a person who presided over all, and he made this decision. That was April 2014, and people started to get sick. Astonishingly, about 6 months later, the GM engine plant in Flint saw that they could not produce their engines without them being corroded by this new water supply. They turned to the unelected manager and said, "We need a waiver. We can't use this water." They got one. And so they switched back to the Detroit water supply as those that worked in the plant and lived in Flint continued to consume the polluted water. People died of Legionnaire's disease, but Also, the children of Flint deeply affected, and that's what we're going to talk with Kurt Guyette about. A year later, it took a year of massive protests and grassroots action and some crusading reporting of our guest today, Kurt Guyette, that the governor was forced to switch the pipes back from the Flint River to the Detroit water supply. But the damage had been done. The lead-coated pipes were completely corroded. And to this day, the people of Flint, if they're drinking that water, are threatened. When we started reporting on this story on Democracy Now!, we were saying, who are the people to go to in Flint when we weren't personally there? And we heard about this reporter, Kurt Guyette. Who did he work for? Which newspaper? What do you mean, the ACLU? A reporter working for the ACLU? And that's what we're going to talk about today as well. Kurt Guyette, how did you end up reporting for the ACLU and then making this story, the polluted Flint River and the terrible devastation it continues to wreak? How did you end up working at the ACLU and investigating this story?
The director of the ACLU of Michigan, Carrie Moss, had the vision to apply to the Ford Foundation for a grant to hire me to specifically investigate and write about Michigan's emergency manager law, which is the most extreme receivership law in the United States. As you said, if a city, county, school district is deemed to be in financial stress, the state has the ability to take over those entities. And these emergency managers have complete, unchecked authority. They can eliminate existing ordinances, create new ordinances, break collective bargaining agreements, sell off assets. The city council or school board or elected mayor, they only have whatever power these emergency managers choose to give them. They only get paid if the emergency manager chooses to pay them. So essentially, they're employees of the emergency manager. And democracy is completely taken away, which is why it is an issue of concern to the ACLU. And one of the reasons when they applied for the grant, they said, you know, what's happening in traditional media and investigative reporting and the way it's being cut back, there's a void there, and we can help fill that void by hiring someone like me.
You had been a reporter for years with the Metro Times?
Yeah, I had been a reporter for 30 years, most of that time in the alternative press, 18 years at the alternative paper in Detroit, the Metro Times, which was good, I think. It was not, you know, the alternative press, every place I worked was always an openly liberal place. We didn't make any bones about it. But still, you know, my approach to investigative reporting, even though my political leanings might lead me to whatever story I wanted to investigate or cover, my attitude always was, once you begin an investigation, you have to let the cards fall where the cards fall, because whatever kind of reporter you want to be, if you don't have credibility, then you're worthless. And so even though, you know, like I said, we didn't ever make any bones about the paper being very liberal in its editorial policies and where we were coming from, the investigations always had to stand on their own and be accurate and completely credible. So going to an advocacy organization was not as big a leap for me as it might have been for, you know, people working for more traditional media. Initially, I was covering the Detroit bankruptcy because to get to bankruptcy, an emergency manager had to be in place. And so my first year on the job, I spent a lot of time writing about that, writing about what was going on with Detroit public schools, which were also taken over by an emergency manager and driven deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. Because these emergency managers law, you might hear that, you know, Detroit was a success story, Detroit is, which is not really accurate in the first place, but there's all these other instances where emergency management has been a real failure. Basically last January, a group of ministers from Detroit that were in contact with ministers up in Flint, hearing about how bad the water was, At that point, the problem was a carcinogenic byproduct of chlorine was being added to the water because initially they just weren't prepared for the switch. And there was E. coli contamination. So in order to deal with the E. coli, they upped the chlorine, and the chlorine created this carcinogenic byproduct, and it was in the water for months and months and months before they told the people about it. And it was revealed in January of 15. That's when my boss said, go up there and check it out and see what's going on. And so I started reporting on it. I started working with a very talented young filmmaker, Kate Levy, and we started to video interviews with people, and we produced a short documentary, seven-minute documentary that was released almost exactly 1 year ago, before the whole lead issue came to the fore. But taking seriously the concerns being expressed by people, because a lot of them felt blown off by the local media.
And in the spring, a year ago of 2015, you had the City Council of Flint, who are now just employees of this unpaid city manager, as the mayor was. You have them voting, what, 7-1?
Yes.
To return the water to the Detroit water system. 7-1. The next day, the unelected city manager says their decision was incomprehensible, even though he'd already given a waiver to the GM plant to return because he saw how corrosive the water was. It would take another half year.
Yes.
Before the governor was forced to unhook the water from the Flint River.
Right. And at that point, the lead contamination was hadn't been revealed. But beginning in February, an employee of the EPA, Miguel Del Toro, who's really the unsung hero in all this because how courageous he was, found out from one of the residents that mandatory corrosion control was not being used, and started asking questions of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality about what was going on. Initially, they lied and said that corrosion control was being used. But Del Toro, really the one government official in all this that actually just did his job and cared about the health and well-being of people, began to investigate and then hooked the one homeowner up with Mark Edwards at Virginia Tech. They tested her water, and they found lead levels of 13,200 parts per billion in one of the samples.
And that's how many times more than you're supposed to have?
Well, so really, 0 levels of lead are safe. If you're drinking water, there should be 0 lead in it because it's such a powerful neurotoxin. At even very low levels, 4 parts per billion, on young children, it starts to lower their IQs, behavioral problems, learning disabilities. The federal action level is 15 parts per billion. If there's 15 parts per billion lead in the water, then remedial action needs to be taken. At 5,000 parts per billion, it's considered hazardous waste. So it's more than 2.5 times hazardous waste levels of lead going into their water. But again, that wasn't known. When the clip that we're going to show, that really hadn't been revealed yet. There was some hints about it, but and the significance of this video that we released was that because we took seriously the concerns of the people and were willing to put it out there, Miguel Del Toro wrote an internal memo saying that because corrosion control was not being used, because these unbelievably high levels of lead were being found in one home's water, because of the way that the city and state were testing the water, which was really a way of cheating, he said that this is, in all probability, not an isolated problem, but wherever there is lead service lines throughout Flint, there's a high likelihood that there's going to be a danger of lead in the water. And so because we had done the video, Miguel gave a copy of that memo to Leanne Walters because being a longtime EPA employee, he was very concerned that it would get watered down and buried in the bureaucracy.
And Leanne Walters was the resident.
Yes.
Whose home he tested.
Yes.
Who had 3 kids.
4 kids.
4 kids.
2 young twins, one of whom had elevated levels of lead in his blood. So one of her kids had been lead poisoned. And she was fiercely determined to find out what was going on and get the word out. Because she was said, you know, it's already happened to my kids. There's nothing we can do about it at this point, but I want to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else's kids. And so she was a driving force, along with this whole group of Flint residents, which is the one thing I always try to emphasize is that, you know, I get credit, other people get credit for exposing this. But it was really the relentless efforts of the people of Flint themselves, a small group, relatively small group, but they were relentless into trying to find out what was going on and trying to get switched back to the Detroit system and to just, they refused to believe the lie that their water was safe.
And explain what happened to Miguel Del Toro's report, this administrator, this scientist within the EPA.
Right, he got slapped down essentially when, you know, I wrote a story, I called Miguel, he talked to me for the story. We printed it, we put the memo up online, and the EPA came down on Miguel. He got pulled off of the Flint situation completely. And, you know, I felt pretty bad about that. I think I made a mistake. I could have done that story without really exposing him. I could have just gone off the memo and talked to Mark Edwards and got the scientific background from him. And it was really, I went back and forth a little bit because I was really concerned about what would happen to Miguel. Miguel wasn't, he had a kind of a false sense of security, I think. Because he had spent work for, he had like almost 30 years in, he was like, you know, there's not much that they can do to me.
And the EPA administrator in charge, the regional administrator, apologized to the city of Flint for his report?
And to the MDEQ. And for the way it was released.
The
because,
Michigan Department of Environmental Quality.
Because he did like break protocol by not having it properly vetted, but he knew what would happen. And they subsequently did like a formal version of his memo, and he was absolutely right. It was way, way, way watered down. So he was absolutely, courageous. And if it wasn't for him doing what he did, I don't know that we would ever know, because they're building a new pipeline, and their whole attitude was they're just going to be on the river for a couple years, and it's like and you can tell by looking at their emails now, all we got to do is get beyond this, just get to the new pipeline, get to the new water source, and this will all be behind us, and no one will ever know, basically. No one will ever know.
So set up this video for us, this 2-minute clip.
So Kate and I started going up to Flint. We went up there together for the first time. In April of 15, there was a protest on the 1-year anniversary of the switchover, and there was maybe 100 people marching through Flint. And some of them, there was one point where they're at a farmer's market, and other people are like yelling at them, like, get a life, because the water was not so bad in all parts of the town, especially in the older, poorer parts of town where they still have these old lead service lines. It was much worse than other parts of town. Or, people with money, they buy whole home filters, and it was not an issue. So I was always struck by the fact that there was only 100 or so people marching through. But, so Kate started interviewing a key group of people that were a member of a coalition fighting to get returned to Detroit. And exactly, almost 1 year ago to this day is when we released this, and this is an edited version of a slightly longer piece that we put up on the web.
So let's take a look.
With the push of a button, the water valve from Detroit was shut off, and the city of Flint's main source of water is now the Flint River.
When we heard it on the news that we might be drinking Flint water, might be going to that, we all thought it was a joke. Because everybody knows how gross the Flint River is. I think there was a Guinness Book of World Records broken for how many shopping carts were in one body of water.
Here's the Flint.
Here's the Flint. Here it is.
And then when, of course, the snow thawed, there was 2 bodies found in it.
Average resident won't notice any difference.
Right. My water's been brown since the switch.
We've had 3 or 4 boil water advisories.
The rashes, the hair loss, the muscle stiffness, the soreness.
My family broke out in a rash. The minute we failed that first test, we should have known.
We ran into some bumps, but what did we do when that happened?
Didn't tell us.
January. You waited
What did we do about that? We started immediately to address the problem.
Without telling the public.
We are telling you now.
Flint residents have nothing to worry about.
Those levels are back to normal.
If you don't believe that particular test, that's your prerogative. This is a democracy.
How is this democracy?
Well, it's as much as we have for now.
We have an old infrastructure. When you change your source water, you disrupt the biofilm that's already built up in those pipes. The pipes are eating themselves from the inside out.
Come to find out I have hemolytic anemia, which now we find is caused by copper toxicity.
In April, beginning of April, we found out my child had lead poisoning, and that's when the city came out and shut my water off. On Detroit, we didn't have these issues.
Put us back on Detroit until you can figure out what you're doing and prove to us beyond a doubt that this water is clean and safe.
You are literally in a fight for your life right now.
We are being saddled with this toxic water because we under a toxic system, under emergency management.
Sir, you're killing us, sir. I'm not killing anybody.
We feel like we live in a third world country. We're getting poisoned water, and we have no rights.
We're going to open up this discussion to all of you and the questions you'll ask. One of the women you see there, Melissa May, is a real leader in the democracy movement in Flint. She was the one sitting with her 2 little boys. She has 3 boys. All 3 experience bone pain every single day, and she's extremely sick all the time. And even in the midst of this, when we saw her in Flint, in the middle of the winter, we went to a local church, and there she was organizing people to go out to their neighbors to ensure that they had filters and they had water. She has never stopped organizing. This story that you tell, Kurt, that you focus so much on, we were honored to be able to run the extended documentary that you and Kate made, like 40, 45 minutes, because nowhere else do you see these people who are the residents of Flint leading the charge. This was not just a governor changing his mind because he's being investigated by the federal authorities, although I'm sure that had a lot to do with it. And now some people have been indicted. But it was as you put it, the relentlessness of these grassroots activists who saw the key issue as democracy.
And there's 2 things from that clip I think they're important to take note of. One is just the cold, callous disregard. The fellow who said, well, I'm telling you now, he was the emergency manager. There's been a whole string of emergency managers because they exploit a loophole in the law in order to keep reappointing these people. And so I was at that meeting, and I never saw a public official talk to people that way. You know, no elected official would talk to their constituents that way because they would not be an elected official very long. But that whole, well, I'm telling you now, it was just like, that was like a crystallizing moment for me. The other thing is when Leanne Walters is sitting there, so we filmed this in April of 15, we filmed her, and she's sitting there talking about the pipes are eating themselves up from the inside out. You know, she's a mom. She was saying at that point exactly what the problem was. None of the officials, none of the experts were, disclosing that. So it's very important. In April of 15, they knew exactly what the problem was. They knew beforehand, but when someone like Leanne can sit there and tell you exactly what the problem is, and in the meantime, they're telling the TV people, everything's safe, everything's safe. It just shows how much of a cover-up this was and how much negligence was involved in this.
And Leanne Walters ultimately moved out of Flint, moved to Virginia. Her husband works for the Navy, but continually comes back to help lead the charge for some kind of justice.
Well, they're getting ready to do another round of tests, because what really broke the whole thing open, or started break, well, first we released the memo. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, first of all, they wouldn't respond to me. You would see it now in emails. It's like this reporter from the ACLU, and they put the word reporter in quotes because they didn't really consider me an actual reporter, and wouldn't respond to my questions. But Michigan Radio, which did an incredible job in pursuing this story, followed up on my report. Reporter came in, I talked to her for a couple hours to explain to her everything that was going on. She called the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and their response was there's no overall problem with lead in Flint's water, so the people there should just relax. That was their word, relax. Even though, and that was several months after Leanne was sitting there talking about exactly what the problem was. So their whole approach all along was to deny there was a problem and attack the credibility of people who were trying to tell the truth. They called Miguel del Toro a rogue employee. But after that came out, then the question was, well, how do you get it beyond a he said, she said story? That you have, on one side, you have the MDEQ saying we're testing water all over the city, it's safe, and on the other side, you have this, one employee who released this unvetted document, although we believe that that was the truth. And so what we did was we came up with the idea of doing our own independent tests. Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech got money from the National Science Foundation, sent 300 sample kits to Flint, and all the residents, and I worked with them and with Edwards, and we did our own tests throughout the city, a much more extensive, much more rigorous test than the city and state were doing, and that's how we proved that the lead was contaminating the city's water supply.
Amazing story. Let's open up the floor to questions, if any.
My first question is from the live stream, actually. We have people watching around wherever they are on the internet. And first question.
Two questions, actually. First was, how did you connect with the filmmaker Kate Levy? And the other is, do you have funding to continue the story?
Kate and I met in federal court on the bankruptcy stuff. I had just done a story, and we had a kind of a working relationship with my former paper, the Metro Times, and done a big cover story about what the real story behind the bankruptcy was, which was not really being told. And so Kate came up and introduced herself, and then we started working on the water shutoff issue in Detroit in the summer of 14. They're shutting off water to tens of thousands of homes in Detroit because people could not afford to pay it. And so that's how we connected, fortunately for me. I'm sorry.
Funding for your reporting.
So my funding comes from a grant from the Ford Foundation, which really, they have to get a lot of credit. This was an experiment, really. No other ACLU in the country had ever had a reporter, an investigative reporter, working for them. And it was a different kind of thing. It was different than other nonprofit journalism models, which are set up as separate, distinct, independent entities. I was going to work for an advocacy organization. So, and there's an interesting debate about whether somebody who works for an organization like that can rightfully be called a reporter or not. And it's a good debate. So like the Pulitzer Committee, they rejected, I submitted some of this stuff for the Pulitzer Prize, and it was rejected because I work for an advocacy organization, so.
Yeah, Paul.
First and foremost, I just want to say, wow, salutations on such an incredible job. I just want to ask you, given in the context of the unanimous Supreme Court decision that just happened about McDonnell, and the governor of Virginia, about corruption, what's the end game? I mean, who benefits? I mean, that's, the Roman phrase, I just am very curious because obviously they knew that this was a disaster, but were they getting paid? Was there somebody like a little boogeyman giving them bags of cash or something? I don't know. It seems so monumentally myopic. Like, yeah, just wow, it blows your mind.
I mean, one thing is that with all those things that I described that the emergency manager can do, the one thing that the law specifies that they cannot do is miss a bond payment. So the bottom line here is the banks get paid no matter what, even if it means poisoning the city's water supply. So that's part of what's going on, is that they get paid. The other thing is that there's no checks and balances. So you have the emergency manager appointed by the governor making this monumental mistake, and then you have the MDEQ, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, run by an appointee of the governor that's basically covering his ass to make sure that it was covered up, because it would have blown things completely apart. It was shown, as it has shown, what fundamental flaws in this law are, and they did everything they could to cover it up and to disavow responsibility for it.
At one point in Michigan, half the black population of Michigan was under unelected city managers. Half of the black population.
Because the cities and school districts being taken over, almost without exception, are majority African American and very poor. 40% of the people of Flint live in below the poverty line. So and I'm so glad that we brought this up, because this is a fundamental thing, is the underlying racism and classism that are involved in this law and the way it's being applied.
A tiny follow-up, which is just like we've seen with privatization of water. Oh yeah, I'm Paul Miller, DJ Spooky. I'm going to be moderating later. But we've seen with privatization of water supplies in other, like, quote-unquote, third world countries, obviously there's some huge corporate or IMF or crazy, pressure on politicians. Was the governor getting some, donations or other things from companies? You're talking about banks and bonds. I mean, obviously you usually follow the dollars, but it just seems so like this weird fog, and then all of a sudden it's just a general bad decision process.
Well, I mean, part of it is just their overall philosophy. The governor came in from the private sector and saying, I'm going to run government like a business, which is exactly what they did. They ran it just like BP, instead of having the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, you had lead contamination because it's not, the most important thing is not the bottom line in government. The most important thing is the protecting the people. And that's one of the problems with that kind of philosophy.
Yes.
This is Chad Beecher with Univision. Terrific, congratulations, great work. How has this changed or encouraged either ACLU of Michigan or ACLU chapters across the country or nationally to use more media to uncover this kind of stuff?
Well, because this really truly was an experiment, one of our benchmarks for success when we began would be if other people tried to replicate what we were doing, which is now happening. I've gotten calls in the past couple weeks from a couple different guys that are looking to be hired either in Pittsburgh or in Texas for the ACLUs there, and they're saying, hey, how's this work out? Because they have some concerns about going to work for an advocacy organization. So that's one change that has come about as a result of this.
And of course, then there was the trickle-up journalism, where we worked with Kurt and Kate and took that documentary that they had made, and you put it on Democracy Now! As an entire broadcast, and then that went out to 1,400 public television and radio stations around the country and around the world.
And then, of course, other media, eventually, we kept pushing and pushing, and it would get a little bit bigger. It went from being just a local story to a regional story to a state story. And then probably last November, when a new mayor declared a state of emergency, then it started to blow up, and everybody started eventually paying attention to it. And one of the benefits of this now, and it's kind of hard to talk about good things coming out of a tragedy like this, because lead causes miscarriages. So people lost their kids because of this, and the damage done to the kids is irreversible. So it's very hard to talk about good things coming out of this. But one thing is everywhere I go, I've been talking a lot lately, everywhere I go, it's it's on the radar here of the issue of lead in the water. And Mark Edwards told me very early on, the biggest problem is not having lead in your water. The biggest problem is having lead in your water and not knowing about it. And so, all over the country now, the issue of lead in people's water is very much on the radar, and people are very much paying attention to it. So the ripple effects have been amazing.
We have to wrap this discussion up, but I also want to say, with Kurt's focus on the grassroots activists, what you see in Flint what turned this story around is the leadership of the women at every level, from Leanne Walters, the young resident with her 4 children, to Melissa Mays, to the pediatrician, who then the governor could not refute, who crunched the numbers and said, do you know how many children in Flint have been affected by this? At every level, it was women. When you focus on who's really the mechanism of change in a community.
And I really want to thank Amy. You know, we put this together as a documentary, and you know, it's like, oh, Kurt, we want something 2 minutes, right? It has to be something that, you know, little bite-sized thing. And it kept growing to a point where it's 45 minutes, and it's like, who's going to watch this, you know? But it was like we just felt it was important to get it down and to literally document the story of what had happened. And because my attitude all along when we began the project was, well, how are we going to get this stuff out? And I kept saying, you know, if the work's good enough, it's going to find an outlet. And I'm so grateful to Amy because she took that 45-minute documentary and made sure people saw it, you know, and heard it on the radio. And that was such an important function. And so very, very thankful for what you did for us.
Well, thank you, Kurt. You're definitely a hero in the journalistic community, and congratulations on the awards you've won. This work continues, and it's ever so important. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.